Welcome to the #1 podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city, so I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
You just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're going to lose. Coming down the stretch, you're going to lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green-white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod here to get our midsummer recruiting update for the Spartans. It might be the off season, but I guess it's unofficially the recruiting season or traditional recruiting season now that we have NILs. We kind of had a recruiting season. I'm not quite sure what to call any of these times now. It's not, things have changed. The landscape is different. But anyway, we're going to go over who's on MSU's radar for 2025 and beyond today. Before we begin, we'd like to thank David Brame for becoming a new supporting listener at the Draymond Green level. If you want to support the show via a one-time donation or on Venmo or PayPal or on a recurring basis through the Substack or Patreon, head on over to our support page at tffinots.com/support. Also, a quick word, I will plan to attend the Moneyball Thursday, July 11th. So if you want to stop by and say hi, please do. Okay, Rod, so let's get into the recruiting. As always, there are a ton of players to talk about because there's a lot of targets, not only for this year, but for the future years. And of course,
well, let's preface this. What we're going to talk about today is limited strictly to 25. MSU has interest in a number of guys already evidenced in 26,
right?
But there aren't as many offers, and that's still, you're still well behind in the curve, and now more than ever, with the way that the portal works, you just can't possibly know.
Sure, yeah.
How many guys, what positions, any of that, right? It truly is a year-to-year sport now, and so we're gonna limit it to 25. So these are the guys who will be in college starting next year for the 25-26 season.
All right, so we'll begin with Nicolo Bundalo, 6'10", power forward from Ohio. And this has been one of the more, I think it's a higher profile recruitments, I think, for Michigan State and a lot of other teams in the Midwest.
And elsewhere.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
Yes, Bundalo is a guy who plays on the Adidas circuit. He's from Ohio. I would say that he's gone from being a guy who was intriguing to, as you say, schools in the upper Midwest, the traditional Big Ten footprint, to definitely a national recruit and a top 20-ish kind of guy. We'll talk a little bit first about what he is as a player. So he goes about 6'10", maybe 200 pounds. So we're not talking about a traditional, don't think Antonio Smith as a power forward. He's a very skilled player and very long, obviously at 6'10", but not a bruiser. He would be a guy that you'd be looking at. It's interesting because I don't think of them necessarily as similar players, but there probably is at least some rough comparison between him and someone like Xavier Booker, right? In that, similar size, similar need to add good weight and strength, and similar in the fact that they're both very, very skilled. I don't think Nicola is quite the athlete that Book is, but at least in a rough sense, you're talking about some similarities. He's got offers from everybody. MSU, North Carolina just offered him recently, and that's a significant one because he's talked about them as being, and I hate this term. I think it means next to nothing, and it gets thrown around, but dream school. He's interested in North Carolina. Let's put it that way. UConn, Kentucky, Alabama, Ohio State, UCLA, and lots of others. So you can see it's truly a national recruitment, high-level schools for a high-level player. Now, MSU has been running strongly with him for a long time, and they've been on him for, I would say, at least 2 years, and in part, that's due to a connection between Doug Wojcik and Mondello's family, his dad in particular. So this is another one of those, and there have been a few of these recruitments in recent years where Doug Wojcik in particular happens to have a connection with somebody, and it leads to MSU's early involvement. In part, I think, because there's an identification early that, hey, this kid that I've got a connection with may actually be a player at our level. The general sense all along has been that MSU is right at the top. In fact, I think that in some quarters there's a suspicion that they're the favorite. He hasn't said any officials yet. I would think that happens soon. In my opinion, UNC would be the other school to watch here, other than Michigan State, from what I've heard and read. But again, until you start seeing the officials unfold and start actually happening, which at this point I would suspect won't happen any earlier than the fall, you don't know for sure how it's going to shake out. But I would think North Carolina is the school to worry about if you're a Michigan State fan. But I think that there's a lot of good reason for confidence if you're Michigan State with this one. He's from the area. I've also heard that there's a desire on the family's part to have him stay close to home, which would favor Michigan State as well. So we'll see how it unfolds. But he's definitely the guy that I think he might not be necessarily the highest rated recruit they're in on, because there are a lot of guys that are rated pretty highly, as you're gonna see. But he's probably the best combination of high ranking and very likely that Michigan State is right there at the end.
And so the obvious question is, which neither of us know, is, what are the needs Michigan State's going to have next year as far as, you look at the roster right now and you've got Akins will be done after this next year. So you'll have a scholarship position for that. And then Zappala, right? And Fiddler.
Yep.
So there'll be 3 spots that you could potentially, recruit to. I guess Fiddler kind of fills that. I mean, you could fill that 6, I guess, at 4 spot. I guess is kind of what you'd think with Mundelo, right?
Well, yeah, he's going to be a 4. I would read this as, look, you never know until you know definitively.
Right.
But right now, as we sit here at the end of June, my guess is that you're probably talking about one more year for Xavier Booker. And I know that sounds crazy to people who don't follow this stuff extremely, they're a little more casual. They said the guy, didn't play that much as a freshman. So yeah, maybe it's natural to expect he'll play more as a sophomore, but you're talking about him leaving? And yeah, I am, because I think that's kind of the plan. And so I would view him as a likely guy. Now, you could say, well, Zappala moves on. That's another big. So even if Booker stays, there's still a spot in that 4 and 5 rotation for another guy, right? And that makes sense. It could be that. But right now, let's put it this way. I would expect Mondello, wherever he goes, is a kind of kid that's looking for an early role. And if Michigan State no longer has Xavier Booker, then there's a role available, at least in theory. So that's how I would view it. But you're right. And it's a funny thing, because there's only the 3 guys for certain that they're going to lose from a 13, and MSU is full up on scholarships this year with 13. So there are only those 3 spots. Will they have more due to attrition, due to guys leaving early, guys transferring? Yeah, it's probably a safe bet that they will. That dictates how, we just talked about it in regard to the 26 class, right? But it also applies to 25. How many high school guys are you going to bring in? And this is all part of the dynamic now for coaches. You've got to think about, well, I'm probably going to want, or I may want, to bring in somebody with experience through the portal. So I've got to make sure I've got at least a slot or 2 available for that, right?
Right.
And yet you don't know. I mean, I could sit here today and say, yeah, I think the plan is that Xavier Booker probably turns pro after next year. But do we know that for certain? No. Do we know out of all the other guys who would have eligibility left that none of them would transfer? No. I mean, you just, and so you've got to approach it that way. I think because of that uncertainty, I'll just say this at this early stage in our discussion, I would be kind of surprised if Michigan State took more than 3 kids in this class. I think it'll be 3.
Yeah.
That would be my guess. But you never know for sure. But that's how I would lean. And that matters because we're going to be talking about a lot of guys. For this point in the year, it's really, this has not been the standard for Michigan State to be in on as many names as we're going to be talking about. And they're all, I'd say all but maybe 1 or 2 are very realistic names where Michigan State is in it. This is not a pipe dream thing, or they got mentioned by somebody, but it's not serious. With all but 1 or 2, and those people are, I just say that about because they're fairly recent offers. So we don't know. It's going to be, the next couple 2-3 months, I think is going to sort all this out as to which directions Michigan State actually ends up turning in, how many guys they add from this class, because there's so much uncertainty. It's not just for Michigan State, it's for everybody.
All right, then let's move on to second player is Trey McKinney, 6'4" power wing from OLSM. He won a gold medal playing for the U.S. under-18s in a recent world championship.
Yeah, I want to give credit to Trey McKinney for one big thing. He has bucked the trend of players in this state that's been going on for several years now. He's actually staying in high school at Michigan.
Yeah, not leaving. Yeah.
Trey McKinney could have gone to any prep school he wanted to, but there's a kid in his class, a guy we're not going to mention because even though he did eventually get an MSU offer, MSU's nowhere in his recruitment and won't be, and that's Darius Acuff, who started his career, his first 2 years at Cass Tech. Acuff won a title in his sophomore year. He won a state championship at Cass Tech. And then he hit the road. He went to IMG. I believe he's still at IMG. Trey McKinney won a state title last year as a junior with Orchard Lake St. Mary, and he's returning to Orchard Lake St. Mary. That's just not been the pattern. It hasn't been the pattern in general for guys from this state. Normally, the high-level guys and this goes back to like the mid-teens at least. If you think about Miles Bridges, for example, Miles Bridges played 1 year of high school ball in Flint, and then he transferred to Huntington Prep in West Virginia.
Right.
And that pattern has repeated with several kids over the years since then. Trey McKinney stuck it out. He's going to do his whole career at Orchard Lake St. Mary. So as someone who, is a big fan of basketball in general in this state, that's really, it's admirable in a way, because it's become a very easy decision to just, okay, I'm ranked in the top 20 nationally. And especially once you've won a state title, people will say, well, what is there to play for? I think being something like Mr. Basketball, winning that must matter to him.
Yeah.
Well, he didn't win it last year, but winning a back-to-back state. Yeah. I'm talking about the individual award, Mr. Basketball, may mean something to him. winning back-to-back state titles. They're not going to be the favorite, but they'll be in the mix because they lost some guys. But, it says something. Now, talking about him beyond that, you mentioned he won a gold medal playing for the U.S. under-18s with Acuff, who I mentioned as a teammate. They play AAU together as well. MSU has worked Trey McKinney hard for years, basically 3-4 years. It has been, I would describe that recruitment as an uphill battle in the sense that it's well understood. His father is not a Michigan State guy, and his father also plays a big role in his life, which is totally, that's fine. That's what you hope for with parents. But Michigan State, I think some things broke well for them in this, and then they did their usual job of when they ID a kid and they put relentless work into it. They are in a better position than I think anybody would have thought they'd be in, say, 2 years ago. The things that broke well for them, I think, is that Michigan just had chaos. I think if Michigan, if this were, say, the John Beilein era, I think that Trey McKinney probably ends up at Michigan just because there was stability. His dad, as I understand it, is a Michigan guy. And it would have made sense, But I think the fact that the Juwan Howard regime got real weird real fast, and, that Michigan is recruiting him under Dusty May, but I think it's hard. I think it's really hard for a guy to come in and in, 4 or 5 months build the kind of relationship that other coaches have with them, especially one like Tom Izzo, who, as I say, has just been relentless. What's interesting about McKinney, and I'm not saying this because, my conclusion is if you put a gun to my head and said, does Trey McKinney end up at Michigan State? I would say no. But I would also say they definitely have a chance. But I would, if I had to make a decision, I'd say no right now. But what's interesting, I'm saying this not because I think that's what's going to happen, but because it honestly is interesting. Trey McKinney is a consensus top 20 guy nationally. When I watch him play, I don't see that. What I see, and this is actually, it's funny, in a lot of ways, his whole thing reminds me of Ty Rodgers, who's at Illinois. It reminds me of it because of the uphill nature of the battle for Michigan State. The fact that despite that, I look at the kid and say, that kid was born to play for Tom Izzo. Tom Izzo agrees with that because he recruits him relentlessly. Didn't get Ty Rodgers in the end, although he fought. We'll see what happens with Trey McKinney. But the other thing here that's interesting is that despite that ranking, his recruitment does not look like a top 20 guys recruitment. If you look at the schools that are on him heavily, it's MSU, Georgetown. Ed Cooley's worked him really hard. First at Providence and then at Georgetown. IU, Rutgers, and the Rutgers thing is there's a connection or an assistant on their staff. Smoke Williamson is a guy who was a key figure with the family AAU program that Trey plays for years before he moved into the college assistants ranks first with Pitt and now with Rutgers. TCU, and then Ohio State and Michigan, as I say, Michigan to some degree. And that tracks with what I see, because with what I see from Trey McKinney, he's about 6'4". He's a wing, not a point guard. Decently skilled, but not eye-poppingly so. Like you don't watch or say, wow, that is a pure shooter, or that guy just goes out and finds points, can score relentlessly, Trey McKinney that's where he kind of reminds me of Ty Rodgers. He does a lot of things. He's more skilled than Ty Rodgers, but in general, he's very strong. That's why I describe him as a power wing, because he's physically put together, and he plays that way. Very good defensive potential, hard-nosed, is not afraid of doing the grunt work, and he can do a lot of things that help you win without necessarily being a guy that, at least at the Big Ten level, I don't think it's an automatic that he's necessarily going to be your number one scoring option. The Ty Rodgers thing I keep coming back to. You think about Ty Rodgers this year especially, you just look up, and he was a guy that was just in the middle of doing things to help you win games a lot for Illinois. And I knew that's what he was going to be. That's why Izzo wanted him so badly. He's not a star, but man, that guy makes your team better. And I think Trey McKinney is that more than what you typically think of when you think of a top 20 guy, where you think, well, that's a near surefire NBA guy who's going to be a big scorer, and all of those things that typically go along with that ranking. I don't see Trey McKinney that way. So to me, if they get him, great, because he's that kind of player. He's a player that I think Izzo would love to coach, and I think he would thrive at Michigan State. If they miss on him, he's not the guy I look at as, wow, that one guy elevates your recruiting class to, you know what I mean?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So it's an all upside thing from an MSU perspective, but they're in it. They're definitely in the recruitment, and they keep going at it. There's been no slack, no let off in terms of the intensity with which they seem to be recruiting him.
Okay. Well, moving on, we just want to dispel a rumor. My friend claims that he contacted the brothers that just do gutters because he needed some gutter work done, and he used the code Illini to get 30% off. This is untrue. You do not get 30% off by saying Illini, just so you know. But if you say Final Four, you definitely get 15% off your gutter work. You can check out the estimate. They do fantastic work. We've been getting deluge. I don't know what it's like on your side of the state, but we've had some monsoons here with some serious rain and pretty significant wind. We had a ton of wind on Tuesday. It knocked out the power. Actually, place I was going to do surgery had no power, so we had to cancel all our operations that day. So anyway, make sure you talk to the brothers at Just Your Gutters. They do fantastic work. They can repair, replace. Maybe your gutters blew off and you need some new ones. So they can do all that. They have great selection and matching. They can do it both residential and commercial. Head on over to our support page of the Final Four on theschedule.com/support to find more information and ways to contact them if you're on the east or the west side of the state. All right. So the next up would be Darius Adams, 6'5" wing, played at La Lu, where Michigan State's had plenty of success finding players from there.
Yeah, he's from the East Coast, but as you say, has played prep ball at La Lumiere, and I believe is slated to be back there next year. Big time player, top 20 guy in some circles, and I would say in general is a top 30 guy on a consensus basis. Has offers from MSU, Alabama, IU, and many others. He's been a priority for MSU for a while. He's unofficially visited to MSU before. I would expect an official in the fall, as by all accounts, MSU's running very strongly in the recruitment. Some people think they lead. This is a guy, unlike Trey McKinney, that is a pure shooter. And I think he's a guy that if he develops along the lines that people think is possible, he could be a number one scoring option in your offense. That's the kind of player that he is. Obviously in college basketball at any point, but maybe now more so than ever, there's always room for a guy that can just go out there and make shots. And I'm not saying that's all he is, but that's the thing that gets emphasized with his game the most. So definitely a name to watch. And he's had a lot of these guys we're going to talk about, but he's one in particular. Has had a very, very good spring. Mm-hmm. And if anything, the perception of his game has elevated a little bit over the last few months. That's my sense.
Okay, then Davion Hanna, another 6'5" wing, top 40. He hails from Wisconsin.
Yeah, another recruitment MSU's been on for a long time. They're perceived to be in the top pack, along with Wisconsin, Alabama, Marquette, USC. There's some other schools, but that would probably, those five, Michigan State and those other four schools I just mentioned, are probably the top pack. Different player than Adams. Hanna is more of a multi-tool guy. Versatile player. People really like his defensive potential. Not the pure shooter that Darius Adams is. In fact, he's had a little trouble this spring with the three. Very good athlete, though. So I suspect that the way they view it is, with some time and a little bit of work on his shot, could be a really effective three-level scorer. But I think he's a guy that you look at as more of a multi-purpose wing, as opposed to somebody who, from day one, you just say, well, this is a guy who can step in and get us double-digit points just by virtue of the way he can score.
Mm-hmm. All right, so if you need to, it's summer, lots of road trips, make sure your car is in good operating condition. You want to go to the Christian Brothers Automotive of Grand Rapids. There are 4 locations. You get, right now they have a special for listeners of the show. If you mention Hoops, you get $40 off a oil change, which includes a courtesy inspection and free tire rotation. It's a pretty good deal, $60, which when I hear $60, I'm like, boy, that seems like a lot, but that's because I'm old, and I remember when it was like $30 or $25 to get your oil changed, and now you can't even go to the store and buy.
It wasn't that long ago.
5 quarts. No, I mean 5 quarts of oil used to be, I don't know, $10 or something. Now it's like, it's crazy. So,
right. Yeah.
Anyway, so but Christian Brothers Automotive, they do fantastic work. They do obviously much more than oil changes. They can change you need your brakes done, you just have some funny noise in your car. If your windshield, or I should say your headlight fluid is low, they can fix that too, top you off. You can head on over again, $40 off. You mentioned Hoops when you want to try and get your oil change. And they've got 4 locations. You can find out more information on our support page, as always. So then we'll go on to Davian, Trent Sisley, 6'7" from Indiana. And this one seems like it's been brewing forever.
Yep. Another guy, and again, not everybody we're talking about, but a lot of these guys have been on MSU's radar for at least a couple of years. And he's definitely a name that was in the mix early. So he's 6'7". I don't know. There was a discussion that I was involved in for a minute on the Spartan Mag board a week or two back with somebody who was insisting that he's actually a big wing. And this person cited as evidence of this a post or tweet from one guy who covers high school basketball in the state of Indiana, insisting that, despite every national guy calling him a power forward, he actually thinks of himself as a guard. Well, I've seen him play. I've seen him play multiple times, and I don't think he's guard. I think he's an undersized power forward. And I say that because that's the way he plays. I've always really liked him. And this is what I mean by the way he plays. He is a high energy, high motor, big activity guy. He's the kind of, I'll tell you what he reminds me of a little bit, and I don't want to take this too far, but he has always struck me as, do you remember Kyle Young that played at Ohio State not that long ago?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Kyle Young was in the same recruiting class that Jaren Jackson was. So 2017. And Kyle Young, and MSU was in on that recruitment, they worked him pretty hard. He was purported to be a great undersized four-man who was a high activity, high motor guy, tough, but skilled. He was all of those things except the skilled part. He could never quite get his three-point shot to fall in college. He was always like a guy who would take some, but he was always like in the high 20s from three. I think this kid is what Kyle Young was purported to be, because I've seen him fill it up. He can shoot. And he just, when I think of a wing, I think of a guy that, we're going to get familiar with somebody like Frankie Fiddler, right? And Frankie Fiddler is not that much smaller than this kid is, but there's a difference in the game. I've never seen him do the things that Frankie Fiddler does with the ball in his hands, for example. So anyway, I really like him, though. I think he's a guy I can easily imagine fitting in for Tom Izzo. He's another one of these guys that you don't have any difficulty projecting him to playing in an Izzo program. because the effort level's high. He can hit shots. He's gonna put in work on the boards, all of those things. His recruitment's a little more well-defined than most of these guys we're talking about, though, because he's actually down to a Final Four, and he's from the state of Indiana.
Yeah.
It's IU, Purdue, Notre Dame, and Michigan State. So it's 3 Indiana schools and Michigan State. He's going to official to all 4 this fall before he makes his decision. There is a school of thought that Purdue and Michigan State are out front. And I can see it from this perspective. And some of this is me reading into things a little bit, what I've heard. But I think it's probably pretty accurate. I don't think a program like Indiana as it is now necessarily would be as appealing to him because it's this high turnover, lots of portal use. It's all that stuff. He strikes me, and the little bit I've heard about him tells me that this is true. This is a kid who would be impressed by the idea that a program he's playing at or wants to play for sticks with guys, works with them, develops them. Mm-hmm. That it's not this purely transactional deal. And I think that plays to Michigan State's benefit. The problem is it also plays to Purdue's benefit because they're the other school in the Big Ten that can credibly say, hey, we don't recruit over guys. We don't push them out the door if it doesn't work in the first 6 months. We work to develop guys, and we would prefer to have a team that's based around that principle as opposed to let's just shuffle guys in and out. So that's the problem for Michigan State is the thing that I think probably plays to their advantage also plays to a competitor's advantage, and they're also in the same state he lives in. So I probably wouldn't pick MSU at this point, but I think they've got a shot because they've been in it all along. They've been in on him, just about as long as anybody. And, he makes sense in this program. He also makes sense at Purdue, though.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of these guys, they have to try and imagine, looking at, and for them, it's not any different than it is for the teams. So you have to project what your role is and what
Absolutely.
what you're going to be doing the next year. You're guessing as much as the coaches are, who's going to be around and then what you're going to be able to do.
So mentioning, sticking with Purdue for a second, Purdue just went through this. They had this kid, Caden Catchings, who had been committed to them for 2 years. They committed during his junior year of high school, same way Jeremy Fears did with Michigan State, right? Mm-hmm. A year earlier. Catchings is a highly regarded player. It's top 30, top 40, which Purdue doesn't always get those guys. Purdue is more a program that, develops guys that are maybe in the lower end of the top 100, and they become very good college players, sometimes pros. But Catchings was actually he comes from a basketball family. His grandfather, Harvey Catchings, I can barely remember playing in the NBA. He was on the 76ers team that lost to Bill Walton and the Trailblazers, which is the first NBA finals I can really remember well. So he was a teammate of like Dr. J, George McGinnis, Doug Collins, all those guys. So he's got bloodlines, etc. High-profile recruit, but 2 or 3 different times after he committed, there were rumors that he was going to decommit, and he never did. But then he apparently went to Purdue. This is according to Matt Painter the other day. Said he wanted to decommit because of what you just mentioned. Like the role wasn't, he wanted guarantees as to his role. And Matt Painter doesn't do guarantees of roles, which, you have to applaud him for that. Same thing, Tom. It's exactly the same reaction Tom Izzo would give a kid. As well, what? No, you earn a role. You're not given a role. And then apparently the day after that, Catchings called him back and said, no, I'm cool. I'm good. Everything's fine. I'm good. And at that point, Painter said, no, you know what? Maybe it's best that we part ways. And the kids ended up at BYU, which is weird. But in any event, it does go to show you're absolutely right. It has to be for the kids. It has to be about evaluating where the opportunity is. And I would say the safe route, certainly if you're a guy who's interested in playing at Michigan State, it's why I mention it in regard to this recruitment. You have to, I think, really understand, am I going to be okay with being here if I don't get the minutes that I'm hoping for right away? Is this a place that I want to be and that I think is going to help me get better? Case in point, Xavier Booker. Xavier Booker played a lesser role than I think the vast majority of people anticipated last year, right? And a lot of kids would have bolted after that, no question. He did not. And so I think what it said was all the stuff during his recruitment about, look, we know that this is a demanding program. He and his family both said these things. That's what we want. That's what he needs. It wasn't bull.
Yeah.
They meant it, right? Because they stuck it out. Here he is coming back for a second year. And the opportunity is going to be very different for him this year. I think it's going to be a very different kind of year. It damn well better be. But you know what I mean? Like that shows. And I think this is another one of those recruitments where this is a player that I think is serious about that. And I think he wants to go someplace that will get him better and is built to do that with him rather than a transactional, hey, if I come in and I'll set the world on fire, they're just going to go add a guy from the portal next spring. And then I'm buried on the bench for year 2. Instead of, hey, I've been in it for a year, I'm getting a chance to grow, and then I'm going to have a legitimate chance to play a bigger role the second year. And by the way, I'm not saying that he can't be an impact guy right away. He might be. But I think that's what probably helps. One of the things that separates out Purdue and Michigan State certainly from Indiana. Notre Dame is in a different spot. Shrewsbury is, I like him as a coach, and I think he's going to do a good job there. But they're at a different point than these other programs we're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so then, again, this will be another name that we've heard a lot of, is Jerry Easter. Much like Hannah, we talked about earlier, he's 6'4", but he'll be playing at Lincoln Academy with him in Missouri after playing at Lalou. And I feel like there's been some talk that this is that there's some questions about sort of, I don't know, character issues is the wrong way, but maybe for personality, if it may not be the right fit.
Yeah. And it's interesting there. If you track sometimes, and it's not foolproof, but sometimes you can tell what's going on by something as simple as the number of games that you see it reported that Michigan State had a coach watching in the spring, right? During AAU season. And there definitely seemed to be a little bit of a downtick with Jerry Easter in that regard at Michigan State. Then there was an article came out maybe a week or two ago where he seems to at least be talking about taking an official to MSU, and that it sounds like MSU is still in it. He's from Toledo, so he's a local-ish guy before he started doing the prep school rumba. He's going to be on a second prep school. Now, a guy I know posts on the Spartan Mag board, very credible, and is plugged into these worlds to some extent, said that he had heard that he was not asked to come back to Lalou. And it's because of those things that you just mentioned. I can't verify with 100% certainty that that's true, but it's possible. And, there is this sentiment out there that Michigan State may have cooled. I would say this. He's the only guy on the recruiting board who really fits the mold of being a point guard. And there's a reason for that. Michigan State's pretty stocked with point guards. Jeremy Fears, to bring in a current news item, I think it was yesterday, actually got his freshman year of eligibility back.
Right.
That's been handled, which was interesting because typically, at least historically, that stuff was done on the back end. Like you petitioned for that after you were done as a senior if you wanted one more year, and then you got it or you didn't. Michigan State opted to do it now, and they've already got it. So he's got 4 more years. So you've got Jeremy Fears basically starting over as a freshman. You have Trey Holloman, who's still got 2 years left, and you have Jace Richardson, who's going to be a freshman this year, who is not just a point guard, but is fully capable of playing that position. I actually think he could be a pretty good one if he did it full time. So that's 3 guys who could play that spot, would likely be there, you would assume for now at least, would be around when a kid like Jerry Easter would be a freshman. I think Jerry Easter sees himself as a point guard, and I think that's correct. When I've seen him play, he looks the part of a point guard. There's always been some surface level similarity between he and AJ Hoggard.
Mm-hmm.
And the stuff about him that we've just been mentioning kind of tracks with that too on the bad side. Similar size. Easter's in better shape than AJ was, certainly at that point of his life. He doesn't have a conditioning problem, but, shooting's not great. It's probably a little better than AJ's was at a similar point, but he's not a great pure shooter. When I've seen him play in the past, it's fair to question whether he's truly a guy who makes everybody around him better. That doesn't mean he's not capable of running an offense or making plays. He is. But, is he the guy you want quarterbacking your offense? So it just sort of feels to me like this is one that's less likely than maybe it once appeared because of how Michigan State's roster has sorted out. Other schools that are mentioned prominently with him, Miami of Florida, Baylor, Ohio State. I'm guessing there might be others who come into the mix before all is said and done. But yeah, right now I would probably not be inclined to bet on him ending up at Michigan State, but we'll see. It's funny because once upon a time, I might have said, like 2 years ago, I might have said he was the most likely
Right.
in this class.
Yeah,
It goes to show you that times change,
Right. Easter needs a resurrection of his.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you're all welcome, guys. So then, before we go on, I just want to remind you that if you need Spartan gear, there's no better place than Nudge Printing. They have fantastic apparel, screen printed, high quality, can sustain multiple washes. I can attest to that personally. That's what all our logoed shirts, and then I have other ones that are not logoed for TIF nuts. They are just great stuff. Favorite of my family's. We have some hoodies and some just plain sweatshirts. Super comfortable, breathable. They've got Gruff Sparty. They've got all the different logos and huge selection. They've got quarter zips and pretty much everything you can imagine. So you can head on over to the nudgeprinting.com and find their giant selection. You get 20% off as a listener to the show if you type in Final Four just as one word into checkout. They also have other schools too, as just a reminder. So if you're looking for maybe another school in the state of Michigan, kids going to Central Michigan or something like that, they have that stuff. They also have Indiana University, which, for whatever reason you want that one, they've got that one too, and Texas State. So anyway, there's a lot of options. Check out Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. They've been the longest and original sponsor for the show. We really appreciate it. Run by Spartan alums, Gabe and Brittany. Okay, so the last name that I feel like we've talked about at least once or twice is Jalen Harrelson, 6'7" wing, and he's, I think, has an official visit coming up pretty soon. And so
Correct.
I guess we'll talk about him because he's, like I said, he's been on the radar for, seems like forever.
Long time. Another one of these guys that's a multi-year recruitment. He's out of Indiana, and he's also a guy who has always been highly ranked. And, it's interesting. The first time I saw him with my own eyes was last summer. So that was coming off his sophomore season. And I saw him in a couple games. He was a teammate of Jesse McCullough's at that point, and Trent Sisley on
Lalu?
No, AAU play.
AAU team. Okay,
Indy,
gotcha.
Spice Indy Heat. I was not knocked out by Jalen Harrelson watching him. Like physically, he passed the eye test. So he's 6'7". He's strong. I mean, he's ready. He could play Big Ten basketball tomorrow physically. But there was talk early in his career that, he's truly a guy who could play on ball. He could be a point guard at his size. Well, how many thousands of guys have we heard that about over the years, and it doesn't end up being true? That doesn't seem to be talked about very much anymore. We seem to have moved past that fantasy. But he's a really good wing prospect. This is a guy, I think, actually, and it's funny, sometimes guys who have a physical advantage, like they're bigger, they're just more physically mature early, have an advantage, and they're ranked highly early, and then it kind of slips as time goes on. There was a kid out of Southern California years and years ago named Shea Cotton who had a book written about him, who was the epitome of that. He's 6'5", built like a fullback, and was a great athlete, and everybody thought he was going to be a superstar. And then kids caught up, and his game didn't progress. I think Harrelson is a guy who had a physical advantage early. Guys caught up, but he's continued to develop his game. So this is a high-level recruitment, and this is what's interesting. I remember at a certain point, there was a lot of talk that, well, he really covets a Duke offer. And Duke's offered him. And so have Kansas. He's also got offers from schools like Auburn and Purdue. But right now, the only three officials he's got are MSU that is, are MSU in mid-September. I think IU's in late August and ND's in between them, Notre Dame. So it's a big, it's an upper Midwest, Big Ten-ish kind of recruitment. I don't know that he'll officially visit places like Duke and Kansas. So it's never seemed like one that MSU was likely to get, but he's been at MSU enough. He's going to visit officially. They've continued to recruit him hard. So it kind of is, it's not quite the same dynamic as Trey McKinney, but I would put it in the same general bucket as I'm not counting on it. I'm not going to be forlorn if they don't get him, but if they got him, yeah, he's a guy who can play, and I think he would help. This is one, and I'm just handicapping this, just not based on any particular knowledge, just more of a general perception sort of thing. He's the kind of guy that it feels like IU will throw everything they got at it. He's an in-state
money.
Kid. that for sure. But also, hey, you can walk into a starting spot next year. Hey, look at all the attention we're paying to you. Hey, you're an in-state guy. Don't you want to be the star at flagship school? All that stuff. And IU, even in this era where they haven't consistently been a factor nationally, so I'm talking like, the Arch Miller regime, even under Mike Woodson, they've gotten some of those guys. They've gotten more guys than the program actually merits they should get, right? Yeah. And so that would be my guess, but it's just a guess.
All right, so then going on to Jordan Scott. So we get to some new players here. A smooth 6'7" wing from Virginia. And I think this is just a reflection a little bit of how the footprint of Michigan State's getting bigger. For sure. Although at this point, so is the Big Ten. So,
yeah, well, that's true. He's from Virginia, which is almost Big Ten country now.
Almost.
And might be. Who the hell knows? We'll see what happens with UVA over time. Yeah, he's actually a guy I would say that Michigan State's been in on for a long time too. And he's a little different than a lot of these guys we've mentioned are guys that I would say even Harrelson fits this mold, where they could do a lot of different things. There's a physical toughness to them. They're not necessarily eye-poppingly skilled players. Jordan Scott, the operative word would be smooth. 6'7", so good size for a wing. Needs to add some strength, I think, but this is a guy who can shoot the ball. He can put the ball on the floor. He can make things happen for himself offensively. He's been high on Michigan State throughout. I mean, multiple years now. He's taken visits to Michigan State. Michigan State has visited him in his home as recently as, I think, May. It was either April or May. They were in there. Other than Michigan State, it looks like it's going to be a local-ish recruitment. The schools he's mentioned wanting to take officials to, besides MSU, are Maryland, Georgetown, and Virginia Tech. And I know UVA has been in there some on him as well, but I haven't seen confirmation that he's going to official there. I have seen it suggested, and I don't know that I'd agree just yet, but it also doesn't strike me as insane, that out of everybody we're talking about tonight, this would be the guy who's most likely to end up at Michigan State. and again, I can't verify that. I don't think it's a crazy thought because there's obviously been such strong mutual interest for a long time. But it is interesting to think about because, as I said, you've got some very diverse guys. Like, I could see a class, if you had a class of Bandalo, Scott, and Darius Adams, and those were your three guys, well, that's a very skilled threesome, right? Those are all guys that can shoot. They're going to bring a ton of offensive potential, but all three guys probably need to get stronger. So you don't know how that's going to factor in terms of, well, how much of an immediate impact can they make? If you look at Michigan State's freshmen this year, at least the two wings, Curtain and Jace Richardson, I have no doubt in my mind that those guys are going to play some level of role in the rotation this year. Why do I say that? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one big one is they're both physically ready to play in the Big Ten. Like, you don't have to do projecting to say, boy, if he can get 10 or 15 pounds of muscle, he'll be good to go. They're ready now. These guys that I just mentioned, well, maybe they get there, but they might need a little bit of time. Whereas if you had a class, if you got Harrelson and Sisley and Davion Hannah or Trey McKinney in there, well, that's not as necessarily skilled a group offensively, but those guys are put together well enough that you can see, at least strength-wise, physically, they're going to be ready to compete pretty much from day one. And then if it's a mix of some of those players, that's interesting too. If they take three guys, it's unlikely that it's a point guard. We know that. They're not really in on very many centers. So it's a lot of wings, couple of power forwards. That's kind of it. So it's going to be some combination of guys at those spots, most likely. And very different profiles from player to player, I guess, is my overarching point.
All right, so then let's go into Cam Ward. He's 6'6" forward from Maryland. So again, East Coast guy and a consensus top 75 player.
Yeah, and again, same part of the country as Jordan Scott. He's a player Michigan State's been more recently involved with. You see schools like UVA, Maryland, and Kansas State, and there are others, but those are three prominent ones in the mix. But he is explicitly, I've read quotes from him, mentioned wanting to official to MSU. One is not scheduled to my knowledge as of yet, but it would not be surprising to see that happen. He's an undersized, despite being 6'6", he's a power forward, really. Good passer, good around the basket, struggles shooting the ball. So it'll be interesting to see if the heat gets turned way up with him. But these last three guys we're going to mention are guys where interest is of a more recent vintage, and therefore it's less certain than the others, I think, as to how strong Michigan State's involvement is. Because everybody we've mentioned up to this point, I'm scanning back through, everybody else we're talking about, Michigan State's been involved with for at least 2 years. So these last three are a little different.
Well, if you like something different and be able to see out your windows for once, check out the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. Those guys will meticulously clean all your windows, the inside, outside, the windowsills, whatever you need done. They can also power wash your house. They will give you 15% off if you go on to get the estimate for them. I mentioned Final Four. So if you're in the Grand Rapids area, you can't go wrong by picking the guys who clean the glass, which brings us to our next player, Chris Sinek. He's a 6'10" big who hopefully clean the glass, and he's now a top 20 guy in some lists. And so he's, as you mentioned, one of the recent additions is a new target for Michigan State.
One of the fastest rising players in the country. He's gone for the last few months from I believe, outside of the top 100 to firmly in the top 20. And there are some people I've seen who cover recruiting suggesting he might be the best center prospect in the country. He's not a bruiser. He could use some strength, but great defensive potential, interesting player offensively, very athletic. He's a native of Louisiana. I just don't know that I believe that Michigan State is likely to be strong on this one, though. I mean, again, he's got over 30 offers: UCLA, UConn, Kentucky, Kansas. One interesting thing, which I've seen people mention, and it remains to be seen how much it'll matter. You know, we've talked about assistants and their impact on recruiting, and my opinion is that in most programs, and Michigan State is no exception, what ultimately matters is the head coach. The head coach is your closer. You know, this isn't football where, hey, a defensive line coach can be the main guy in a recruitment, and the head coach just kind of comes in to glad hand at the end, but it's really the assistant. It's not basketball. It's not how it works. What assistants do, I'm not saying they don't matter. What they do is with relationships they may have, they can get a head coach in the door. And I think what's interesting is, you know, we've got 3 guys in this group that are all going to be at Link Academy, which is a school in Missouri. It's a fairly new prep school in Missouri. And CMAC is one of them. One thing worth mentioning is Sadi Washington was involved. I believe he was the point man, other than Juwan Howard, of course, in Terrace Reed's recruitment. And Terrace Reed played at Link. Okay. Now, that's all supposition. I don't have anything concrete that says, yeah, that mattered a lot, and Sadi will be able to get him in the door, and they'll be a factor in this recruitment. But it's, you know, it's not nothing. So with this one, and I would say this about the guy we just mentioned, Cam Ward, and then for different reasons, these last 2 we're going to talk about, I would wait and see if Michigan State has any traction, meaning are they getting a visit? If they get an official, okay, great. But this guy in particular, there's so many schools involved, and it's a who's who of the big timers that, and he's not a Midwest guy. There's nothing on the surface that would suggest Michigan State, you know, would have a great chance, but we'll just see. And he's the only real center that they seem to be recruiting. There's that too. I don't think there's a feeling that they desperately need a center in this class.
Is that a little strange to you? Because, you know, if you bring in a center in this class, you'd have a freshman center, and then you'd have 2 senior centers, assuming, you know, nothing changes. And then otherwise you're just recruiting a center you think can start or, you know, maybe 2 centers you think can start the next year.
I would say a couple things. One, I would say it may say something about how they view Trey McCulloch in the long run.
Right.
I don't know that, but I think there'd been a feeling that he was, because he's a guy who has, you know, reputation as being able to shoot, so that maybe he would be a 4. Maybe they view his long-term potential more as a 5, which then gives you 1 younger player. The other thing is, it just may be that they think they don't like for whatever reason, most of the centers that are either guys they don't think they can get, or they just don't think are good enough in this class to warrant getting involved with. So it could be that. You know, the portal is always lurking out there as a possible thought in this entire process. So, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I could see the argument that you're making here for it, but you just look at what they're doing, and it seems like this is a guy that you go after because he's simply too good to not take if you can get him.
Yeah.
You know, as opposed to, well, we have a need for a young big man. Here's the other thing too. if you're ranked where he's ranked and you have the profile that he's got, athletic, with good length, that often spells one and done. So is he really solving anything for you? It might be that he's there for the 1 year that the other two guys are seniors, then you're starting all over anyway.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly with the portal, there's so much more uncertainty in the movement of players, and at least go in the Michigan State message boards, there are plenty of fives around to pick up at any time. So if you ever need a big man, they're all over the place. You trip over them. Just walking on campus, you trip over guys who are 7 feet tall.
Yeah.
They're all over the place.
Yeah, I tend to think this is what their whole thing here with this class tells me is they don't see it as a priority, but this was a guy that for whatever reason, the combination of what they saw on the court and I assume what kind of vibe they got suggested it was worth offering.
Yeah.
Because if you do end up in that mix, hey, you're adding a guy with a ton of potential to help you short term. And, that's kind of it.
Yeah. All right. And so finally, we'll move on to Braylon Mullins, 6'5" wing from Indiana. So again, we're mainly seeing the Midwest for most of these players. And so this is one who's been new onto the radar at Michigan State.
Yeah. This is another guy, dramatic rise in the recruiting rankings. You could make an argument, and I haven't seen all these guys by any means, but just the perception I have, that there'd probably be a pretty good argument that nobody has had a better spring than Mullins. I mean, this guy has gone from being, he's on a very good AAU team. I don't believe he's with on the Adidas circuit with Sisley and a kid named Malachi Moreno, who's being recruited by a lot of big time schools. He's a big man. And it seems like Mullins has actually had the best year. He's shooting some crazy number, like over 50% from three on high volume for the spring.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. So we're talking about a guy that's come from he might have even been outside the top 100, but definitely the lower echelons, top 100 to he could end up a top 10, top 15 guy before it's done. So he's got Indiana's been in heavily for a while. Since May, you've had the following schools offer him: Purdue, Kansas, Stanford, Creighton, Michigan State, Alabama, Virginia, UConn, Michigan, Tennessee, Kentucky. The only one I don't see there is Duke. So pretty much, North Carolina's in there too. Sorry, I forgot that. So it's basically everybody who matters except Duke. I will say this. It's interesting because since they offered, Michigan State has watched him a lot. Now, they're also recruiting an AAU teammate of his. So how much of that is discernible, right? But they've seen him. They also came and watched his high school team play during this period where AAU is on break in June. There's typically not much going on AAU-wise in June, but some states, a lot of states, your high school teams will play in tournaments or invitationals,
Okay.
And his dean of Michigan State was there. It has looked to me as if Indiana has been in full court press mode with him for a while. Will be very interesting to see how his recruitment sorts out. Again, Michigan State seems serious about it, but you do have to wonder. Yes, it's one thing when you come into recruitments like Cohen Carr's and Garrick Norman's late, but you say, okay, who's the competition? Well, it's Tennessee, and it's Georgia, Texas A&M, schools like that. Not bad programs, but they're schools that if you're Michigan State and you have Tom Izzo's aura and all the Final Four banners and all that stuff, you'd say, yeah, I think we can come in late and we can be right there. I don't know that that's this one, though, because this is pretty much again, other than Duke, this is pretty much everybody. Everybody you view as a peer for Michigan State is in this one. So can you come in this late to that kind of recruitment and even be in a spot to get an official? Maybe. I mean, we'll see. But I don't feel ultra confident about it. I also don't lose a lot of sleep over it because, again, Michigan State is in very competitively with a lot of guys who play the same position, more or less, as Mullins. So I feel pretty confident Michigan State's going to end up with at least one and maybe two really good wings. Mm-hmm. So if you don't get Mullins, okay. But they're in it. Maybe proximity to home matters, and that gives them an edge with him. I don't know enough about the recruitment. But, I mean, this is a guy who it's interesting to me how it happens. It goes to show you that it's still possible, even in this media-saturated day and age where you have sixth graders being ranked, that a guy can kind of go under the radar and then all of a sudden explode. Because when you look at him, he's a pure shooter, but he's been that. He's also a very good ball handler, and he's a better than average athlete too. So there's not a lot of obvious weaknesses other than the fact that he's 180 pounds, so maybe you'd like him to be a little bit stronger, but it certainly doesn't seem that it's not possible for him to get where he wants to go physically by the time he suits up for his freshman year. So it's just funny how that goes, that you can have a guy go from basically around number 100 to maybe top 10 in a short period of time. It still happens.
One of the questions I have real quick is, if let's say you're Northwestern, how do they work with these offers? Because lots of, I see UK and Duke and a lot of these players. I imagine they put in lots and lots of offers with these, they know they're not going to get a majority of these players anyway, because they're, competing against all these other teams. The lesser programs like a Northwestern or, like let's say Iowa, do they even bother? Do they even send a letter to this CNAC or Mullins, this guy saying, hey, we'd love for you to come visit, or we offer you?
I think it depends. This was one of the reasons, by the way, when Michigan State brought John Borovich back a couple of years ago. My understanding is one of the main reasons they did that is they really liked the fact that he had been a key guy in Northwestern's recruiting. And so because of that, because of what you're alluding to, the difficulties that recruiting to a program like that presents, that he really had a broad network of contacts and understood purely how to be an effective recruiter, because he wasn't just, this would be the argument. If you're an assistant at Kansas, how hard do you really have to work? Yeah. Okay. Or Duke, even Michigan State to some extent, although not as much as some of the true rarefied air schools, those 4 or 5 at the top, those places kind of recruit themselves to some extent. If you're a guy if you're an assistant at Northwestern, you got to work, because you don't benefit from that automatic, oh, it's Northwestern, of course I'm interested. I think what you're talking about, it really depends on a lot of different things. One thing would be timing. For example, it's not an accident that oftentimes the best players in Michigan will get their first offers, sometimes even when they're freshmen in high school, from Eastern Michigan or Oakland, right? Okay. Those schools are trying to establish a foot in the door in case that player doesn't blow up, doesn't make good on all of their potential, but yet they'd still be good enough to help them.
Sure.
I think to some extent Northwestern can do some of those things, but I think the trick at a place like that is more about talent identification and understanding who's gettable.
Yeah.
Like if you look at Michigan State's football program right now.
Yeah, with Antonio, that's a good example. Yeah.
Well, he would be a great example, but I'm saying even the current staff, the one they've got right now. And I look, I don't follow it as closely as I do the stuff we're talking about, but it seems to me what they're doing that is very different than the previous staff is they're trying to identify who's a guy we think can be good enough to play here, good enough to help us win games, but that is realistic for us to land.
Yeah.
And so you're not seeing them in these high-profile recruitments with 5 stars that the previous staff was, and yet was not landing a lot of those players.
Right. Just a different strategy. Yeah.
Yeah, and we talk about this all the time. Sometimes fans think as if it's, again, I hate to use the analogy, but it fits. I think it's a video game. It's not a video game. There are only so many hours in a day. There are only so many jets at your disposal to go visit kids, right? There's only so much time to be able to watch a player, talk to a player, text a player. You have to be smart in terms of how you use the resources at hand. And so I think for a program like Northwestern, that's really, or taking even up a level from that, somebody like Iowa. Iowa will occasionally get involved with a guy who's high profile. They usually lose them, but occasionally they'll be involved in those recruitments. But they pick their spots. My sense is if they find, well, here's a guy we have an in with, or we identified him and got involved early before he really blew up, or he fits what we do. He doesn't want to play defense. He wants to shoot. So he fits, you know what I mean? Like it's those kind of, they might get into, the last one was kind of a joke, but not really. It makes sense, right? But they're not going to waste all their time. Let's put it this way. You don't see Iowa's name pop up in a lot of the recruitments that Michigan State's involved in.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
You do see, Duke, Kentucky, Kansas, often enough, more often than we'd like. Ohio State, Michigan, Indiana, Purdue. You see a certain level of school that we consistently find are recruiting the same kids that Michigan State is. That's because those schools believe they've got legitimate chances at the same caliber of player, whereas a school like Iowa or Rutgers, well, Rutgers may be a little different now, but Iowa or Nebraska or Northwestern or Minnesota, they're probably going to focus on a different kind of player because they've only got so much time and so many resources available. So we don't want to waste it on guys we have no prayer of getting. Let's focus on guys we got a shot with. The other thing about Northwestern real quickly is you do legitimately have more. I'm not going to say it's the same as for any incoming student because we know that's a crock, but there is more of an academic barrier there than at almost any other. I would say the only other power school that probably compares is Stanford, from what I understand. Right. Mm-hmm. In terms of the admission stuff, you don't have to be a good enough student to have been admitted as a regular student without basketball, but you probably got to be, the standard is higher than it's going to be even at good schools like Michigan or Virginia or Carolina or Texas, Yeah. It's a different deal with those two schools. That's my understanding, at least.
All right, well, we'll wrap it up there. Ron, I wish you all a great Independence Day, and hopefully you have some nice time outside. We have get some good weather, nice and hot, and good barbecues. Check out our support page at thefinalfoursontheschedule.com/support. There you can find ways to contact all our sponsors. Also, if you want to chip in a little bit to the show too, we'd appreciate that as well. So until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go green.
This is a special alert to all Americans who own a vehicle with less than 200,000 miles with an auto warranty about to expire or with no warranty coverage at all. With summer heat quickly approaching, CarShield is offering a low-cost month-to-month vehicle protection plan that is available to the public to save any driver out-of-pocket expenses on future auto repairs. Visit now to see why CarShield is voted America's most trusted vehicle protection company and see why our commitment to our customers has landed us an A rating with the Better Business Bureau. We have live reps here to answer all your questions, but you have to visit now. Visit carshield.com/audio now. Drivers who are covered will have peace of mind when it comes to breakdowns. This protection plan is at an all-time low. Additionally, drivers who activate this vehicle protection today will also receive roadside assistance, towing, and car rental options at no additional cost. Visit us for your free quick quote today. carshield.com/audio. That's carshield.com/audio. What do you have to lose? carshield.com/audio.